The Widow Mine is a Tier 2 ground unit for Terran. Once you have a factory, you can make the Widow Mine right away, and if that factory has a reactor, you can make 2 at once. The Widow Mine is a unique unit that's useful in all 3 matchups. It's a very small unit that can burrow underground and then will shoot a very explosive, high splash damage missile at anything that comes into range. The one drawback is that the Widow Mine takes a long time to reload. Widow Mines can be very useful in the early game of Terran vs. Terran. Because mules and scans come out of the same group of energy, by dropping a Widow Mine in your opponent's base and burrowing it, you're effectively getting rid of a scan. And this scan, it's worth a lot of minerals because it was supposed to be a mule. Also, the Widow Mine may end up killing things. This combos very well with Cloaked Banshees because you really put a stress on their economy and on their scans. Widow Mines are very useful for early harassment against Protoss. Because Protoss generally doesn't have a lot of units in the early game, you can push in with a medevac or even with Widow Mines on the ground and get them burrowed rather easily. If Protoss doesn't have any detection nearby and doesn't move probes quick enough, you can end up dealing a lot of damage with a Widow Mine drop. They're also useful defensively if your opponent goes for Oracles. The Oracles will fly right in and get one-shotted by the Widow Mines. Widow Mines are mostly found in the Terran vs. Zerg matchup. In fact, since Heart of the Swarm came out, they've mostly replaced siege tanks as the main form of splash damage in the Terran army against Zerg. You'll use them in your main army with your Marines, Marauders, and Medevacs, and when Zerg is running at you with Zerglings, Banelings, or anything else, you can simply stim and run backwards over the mines. The mines will then trigger and deal massive amounts of splash damage to the very low hit point, clumped up Zerg army. The Drilling Claws upgrade is very important to get against Zerg because you'll be using the Widow Mines all game long. It's less important against Terran and Protoss because generally speaking you're only going to use Widow Mines in the early game. Now for attack and armor, neither upgrade really matters for the Widow Mine. It already has very high damage and very low hit points. If they ever actually come under attack, they're going to die, so don't bother getting upgrades specifically for the Widow Mines. So remember, Widow Mines are going to be useful in the early game against Terran to try to make them burn scans and not get to use mules. Against Protoss, you're going to try to kill probes, and sometimes you'll defend against Oracles with them. Against Zerg, you'll end up using the Widow Mine all game long and really rely upon it as your main form of splash damage. The Hellbat is a tier 2.5 ground unit for Terran. Once you have the factory up, you can make an armory and then start producing Hellbats out of your factory. You can either get the upgrade for Hellions to transform in and out of Hellbats, or you can just produce them by themselves. Also, if you have a reactor, you can build 2 Hellbats at a time out of your factory. In Terran vs. Terran, the Hellbat is used primarily in 2 different ways. First is early game drops. Terran won't have a lot that can beat the Hellbat early on, so by dropping it in your opponent's base, you can oftentimes get a lot of SCV kills, which can give you a big lead in the game. It's also used with mech compositions. The Hellbat is very good at tanking damage as well as dealing damage, so anytime that you're trying to go for mech, it's good to make a lot of Hellbats. While Hellbats can be used in some early game all-ins against Zerg, normally they're just used for harassment. You'll put them in medevacs, fly them into the Zerg base, and try to kill the drones off with the high splash damage. It's normally a very effective strategy, so definitely one that you're going to run into as a Zerg quite often, or use as a Terran against Zerg almost every game. Hellbats can be very useful in the early game as harassment against Protoss, but also they're very useful in the late game to soak up damage from Zealots as well as kill them with their splash very quickly. In the early game, just like against the other 2 races, you'll just put them into a medevac, fly into the Protoss base, and try to get as many probes as possible. When it gets a bit later, Zealots are the main meat of the Protoss army, and they take a lot of damage from Hellbats. Therefore, mixing in a lot of Hellbats with your army and keeping them in the front row can be very useful indeed. You can kill off the Zealots quite quickly without taking a lot of damage on your Marines and Marauders. The transformation upgrade for the Hellbat that turns it in and out of Hellion form is not very useful. You either want Hellions or you want Hellbats. They fill different roles and generally not the same roles in the same game. As for attack and armor upgrades, they're both very useful for the Hellbat. In any game in which you're planning on making a lot of Hellbats, it's quite useful to upgrade either one out of the armory. So remember, when you're playing Terran, make a lot of Hellbats. They're really useful, especially for dropping on your opponent. If you can kill a lot of their workers early on, you'll be at a huge advantage, and this is what the Hellbats are best at.